A cop forced a black boy to lick the ground, but he didn't know who was filming. What would you do if you witnessed an act of abuse of power so shocking that it left you speechless? Here's the story of how a moment of cruelty became a catalyst for change. On a hot summer afternoon in Chicago, February 4th, 2025, young Luke, a 12-year-old black student, was walking peacefully in his neighborhood park when his life changed forever. What should have been an ordinary day turned into a nightmare when a police officer stopped the boy for no apparent reason. Before we continue, if you like this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to not miss our next exciting stories. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? The officer, a middle-aged man with a cold stare, began to aggressively question Luke. The questions were absurd, baseless accusations of a crime the boy didn't even know had occurred. The situation quickly escalated when the officer, frustrated by Luke's confused and frightened responses, did something unimaginable. "You're gonna learn to respect authority, kid," growled the officer, pushing Luke to the ground. "Now lick the ground and beg for forgiveness." The terror in Luke's eyes was palpable. He trembled, tears streaming down his face as the officer pressed him with his foot. What the aggressor didn't know was that someone was witnessing the scene, filming everything with a state-of-the-art smartphone. The witness, hidden behind a nearby tree, felt their heart racing. Their hands shook as they continued filming, knowing this video could change everything. But who was this mysterious person, and what would they do with this explosive evidence? As Luke, humiliated and terrified, approached the dirty ground, the witness made a decision that would change the course of events. Their finger hovered over the live stream button on the social media app, a choice that could instantly expose the brutality to the world, but could also put the witness's very life in danger. The officer, unaware of the camera watching him, continued his abuse of power. "That's right, you little punk. Learn your place," he mocked as Luke sobbed, his face inches from the dirty ground. At this crucial moment, a question hung in the air. What would happen if the video was streamed? The consequences would be immediate and devastating, not just for the officer, but for the entire system that allowed such abuses. The tension was palpable. The witness's finger trembled over the phone screen. Luke, seconds away from the ultimate humiliation, closed his eyes, praying for a miracle. Would justice prevail? Or would this be just another case of police abuse swept under the rug? The mysterious witness's decision was about to trigger a series of events that no one could have foreseen. And what would you do if you were in this witness's place? The courage to expose the truth doesn't always come without a price. Sometimes the path to justice is full of unexpected dangers. Grant Park, usually a haven of peace and leisure in Chicago, was now the theater of a grotesque scene of abuse of power. The scorching sun seemed to intensify the tension in the air as sweat rolled down Luke's terrified face. The hidden witness, we now know, was Maria, a 28-year-old journalist who happened to be there by chance. Her heart was pounding as she continued filming, torn between professional duty and fear of the consequences. Maria knew that streaming this video could be dangerous, but it could also be the key to necessary change. The officer, whom we'll later discover is Sergeant Robert Johnson, had a controversial past in the department. Rumors of aggressive behavior and prejudice had followed him for years, but nothing substantial enough to tarnish his record. His face, twisted into a mask of hatred and prejudice, revealed years of deep-rooted biases and a warped sense of authority. Luke, on the other hand, was the son of Mrs. Williams, a respected teacher in the community. He was known for his easy smile and passion for mathematics. At this moment, however, the sparkle in his eyes had been replaced by pure terror. A few yards away, a group of teenagers was walking by, unaware of the scene unfolding. Among them was Julie, Luke's best friend. When she caught sight of her friend on the ground, her first instinct was to run to help, but fear paralyzed her. Maria, noticing the teenager's presence, feared the situation could escalate further. She knew she had to act fast. With trembling hands, Maria finally made her decision. She pressed the live stream button on her social media app. Within seconds, dozens, then hundreds of people began to witness the shocking scene in real time. Sergeant Johnson, still unaware of the broadcast, continued his intimidation. "Come on, kid, show some respect," he shouted, increasing the pressure on Luke's back. At that moment, Julie finally found her voice. "Stop! Leave him alone!" she cried, running towards the scene. Julie's cry caught Sergeant Johnson's attention, who turned abruptly. His face paled as he saw not only the group of teenagers, but also Maria's phone pointed in his direction. "What do you think you're doing?" he growled at Maria, letting go of Luke and advancing towards the journalist. Maria, her heart racing, responded with a calmness she didn't feel. "I'm doing my job, Sergeant." "And you? Are you doing yours?" The live stream already had thousands of viewers. Furious comments flooded the screen, demanding justice and the officer's identification. Luke, still on the ground, looked at Julie with a mixture of relief and fear. She ran to help him up, while the other teenagers formed a protective circle around them. Sergeant Johnson, realizing the situation had completely slipped out of his control, stepped back. His radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice, informing him that several calls had been made, reporting police abuse in the park. Maria, sensing the tide turning, decided to press on. "Sergeant, do you wish to comment on your actions? Thousands of people are watching right now." Sergeant Johnson's face alternated between anger and fear. He knew his career, built over 2 decades, could end right here, in this park, under the eyes of all of America. As sirens began to wail in the distance, announcing the arrival of backup, a question hung in the air. How would this situation unfold? Would justice prevail, or would the system protect one of its own? Luke, now in Julie's arms, looked at Maria with a mixture of gratitude and hope. At that moment he didn't know it, but his life and the lives of everyone present were about to change forever. The live stream continued, and all of America watched, horrified and furious, as the scene unfolded. What would happen next? The sirens grew louder, echoing through the streets of Chicago. Sergeant Johnson, now aware of the gravity of the situation, desperately tried to regain control. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice trembling between anger and fear. "I was just doing my job. This boy is a suspect in a criminal case." Maria, keeping the camera steady, shot back, "What case, Sergeant? And since when does doing your job include forcing a child to lick the ground?" Maria's words hit Sergeant Johnson like a punch. He looked around, realizing he was surrounded not only by the teenagers and the journalist, but also by a growing crowd of local residents drawn by the commotion and notifications on their phones about the live stream. Luke, still shaken but regaining courage from the support around him, finally spoke. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking home from school." Luke's voice, though trembling, carried a strength that surprised everyone. Julie squeezed his hand in support, while the other teenagers murmured words of encouragement. At that moment, 2 police cars arrived at the park, followed by an unmarked car. From the car stepped a middle-aged woman in an impeccable suit. It was Captain Sophie Reynolds, known for her firm stance against police corruption. "What's going on here?" she asked, her authoritative voice silencing the crowd. Maria, seizing the opportunity, quickly summarized the situation. "Captain, we have video evidence of an officer abusing his authority towards a minor." Captain Reynolds looked sternly at Sergeant Johnson, who now seemed much smaller in his uniform. "Is this true, Sergeant?" Before Johnson could answer, the captain's phone rang. It was the police commissioner, already aware of the live stream that was going viral on social media. As the captain spoke on the phone, away from the group, the tension in the park was palpable. Luke, now calmer, stared at Sergeant Johnson, years of fear and anger contained in his gaze. Maria, sensing the importance of the moment, continued to comment for her online audience, which now exceeded 1 million viewers. We are witnessing a crucial moment. How will our authorities respond to this flagrant abuse of power? Captain Reynolds, ending the call, turned to the group with a grave expression. Sergeant Johnson, you are suspended from duty until a full investigation is conducted. Please hand over your gun and badge. A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Sergeant Johnson, visibly shaken, tried to protest. But Captain, you can't. I can and I will, Reynolds firmly interrupted. Your actions today have not only violated this young man's rights, they've also tarnished the reputation of the entire police force. This will not go unpunished. As Sergeant Johnson was escorted to one of the police cars, Captain Reynolds approached Luke. Her tone changed, becoming gentle. Son, I'm sorry for what you've been through. I promise you we will see justice done. Luke, still holding Julie's hand, nodded silently. His mother, Mrs. Williams, arrived at that moment, running to embrace her son. Baby, are you okay? What happened? The emotional scene of the mother and son's embrace left not a dry eye in the park. Maria, still live, narrated the moment with contained emotion in her voice. Captain Reynolds then addressed the crowd and the cameras. What happened here today is unacceptable. We will open a thorough investigation not only into this incident, but into Sergeant Johnson's entire history. I ask anyone who may have witnessed similar abuses to come forward. It's time to clean up our police force. As the crowd applauded the captain's words, Maria felt a hand on her shoulder. It was her editor-in-chief, who had rushed to the scene as soon as the broadcast started going viral. Maria, this is first-class journalism, he said proudly. I want you to lead the coverage of this case. We're going to turn this into a series of investigations into police abuses. The young journalist nodded, determined. She knew that her decision to live stream had not only saved Luke, but could be the catalyst for bigger change. As the park slowly emptied, with Luke and his mother being taken to make an official statement and Sergeant Johnson facing the consequences of his actions, a question hung in the air. Was this the beginning of a real reform of the Chicago police, or just another case destined to be forgotten? The story of Luke, Sergeant Johnson, and Maria was far from over. In reality, it was just beginning, and its repercussions would be felt far beyond this Chicago park. In the weeks following the incident at Grant Park, Chicago found itself at the center of a media whirlwind. Luke and Sergeant Johnson's story was no longer just local. It had become the starting point for a national debate on institutional racism and abuse of power within the police force. Maria, now heading the coverage of the case for her newspaper, dove deep into the investigation. She discovered that Sergeant Johnson's past was much darker than initially thought. Several complaints had been filed against him over the years, but all had been systematically suppressed or ignored. One of these complaints came from Mrs. Turner, a 70-year-old lady who lived in the same neighborhood as Luke. He threatened my grandson the same way 2 years ago, she told Maria, tears in her eyes. Nobody believed us at the time. Who was going to believe a black boy against a police officer's word? Meanwhile, Luke was fighting his own battles. Despite the support of his family and friends, he struggled to overcome the trauma. Nightmares woke him in the middle of the night, and he refused to pass near the park where the incident had occurred. Julie, determined to help her friend, organized a support group at school. We can't let fear win, she told her classmates. We need to show Luke and everyone who has suffered like him that they're not alone. Julie's initiative quickly gained momentum. Soon, students from other schools in the city began forming their own support and awareness groups about police abuse and racism. At the police station, Captain Reynolds faced resistance from some colleagues as she led the investigation. You're opening a Pandora's box, one of her superiors warned, but Reynolds remained steadfast. If it's a Pandora's box, it's high time it was opened, she replied firmly. As more victims came forward, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Sergeant Johnson was not an isolated case, but part of a culture of impunity that permeated certain sectors of the police force. Maria, working tirelessly, connected various cases of abuse. She uncovered an informal network of police officers who protected each other, concealing crimes and intimidating victims and witnesses. One day, while digging through dusty City Hall archives, Maria made a shocking discovery. Documents showed that high-ranking government officials had been aware of the abuses for years, but had chosen to cover them up to avoid scandals. This revelation threatened to shake the power structures in Chicago. Maria knew that publishing this information would be dangerous, but could also be the catalyst for real change. Meanwhile, Sergeant Johnson's trial was approaching. The city was in turmoil, with daily demonstrations demanding justice for Luke and all the other victims. Luke, gathering all his courage, decided to testify in court. "I can't let fear control me forever," he told his mother the night before the trial. The evening before publishing her explosive article, Maria received an anonymous call. A distorted voice warned her, "You're meddling with forces you don't understand. Back off now, or there will be consequences." The journalist felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she was getting close to something big, something that could change the course of Chicago's history, and perhaps that of the entire country. But at what price? As the city anxiously awaited the start of the trial and the publication of Maria's article, a question hung in the air. How far did the roots of this corruption extend, and who would be willing to sacrifice everything to maintain the status quo? The fight for justice was about to enter its most dangerous and decisive phase. Luke, Maria, Captain Reynolds, and everyone involved were on the edge of a precipice, not knowing whether what awaited them was redemption or ruin. The day of Sergeant Johnson's trial dawned on a Chicago in turmoil. The streets around the courthouse were packed with protesters, some supporting Luke and demanding justice, others defending the police and Sergeant Johnson. Inside the courtroom, Luke sat nervously beside his mother, Mrs. Williams. His eyes met Julie's in the gallery, who offered an encouraging smile. Maria was present, her notepad ready, determined to document every moment of this historic trial. Sergeant Johnson entered, escorted by officers. His face, once full of arrogance, now showed signs of stress and worry. He cast a quick glance at Luke, a mixture of anger and fear in his eyes. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of power, Maria's investigative article was causing panic. Politicians and high-ranking officials were holding emergency meetings, desperately trying to contain what could become the biggest scandal in Chicago's recent history. In the courtroom, the prosecutor presented the case forcefully. "What we see here is not just an isolated incident, but a symptom of a systemic problem," he declared. "A problem that has allowed Sergeant Johnson to abuse his power for years, victimizing innocent citizens, especially young black men like Luke." Sergeant Johnson's defense tried to paint a different picture, claiming he was a dedicated officer pushed to the brink by a system that demanded results at any cost. "My client is a scapegoat for larger problems within the police force," argued the defense attorney. The crucial moment came when Luke was called to testify. In a trembling but determined voice, he recounted the events of that fateful day in the park. "I was scared, more scared than I've ever been in my life," Luke said, his voice gaining confidence. "But now I know that staying silent only allows this to keep happening to others like me." Luke's testimony deeply moved those present in the courtroom. Even some of Sergeant Johnson's supporters seemed shaken by the young man's sincerity. As the trial unfolded, Maria received an urgent message from her anonymous source. "They know about the article. They're planning to discredit you. Be careful." Heart-pounding, Maria realized she was in a race against time. She needed to publish the article before her opponents could act, but she also had to ensure every detail was irrefutable. Back in the courtroom, Captain Reynolds was called to testify. She presented damning evidence of a cover-up culture within the police force. Sergeant Johnson's case is not an exception. It's the tip of the iceberg. she stated, causing a stir in the room. The trial was nearing its end, and the tension was palpable. The jury retired to deliberate, leaving everyone in a state of anxiety. At this critical moment, Maria made a bold decision. She sent her article for publication, knowing it could influence not only the outcome of the trial, but the entire Chicago judicial system. Minutes after the online publication, phones in the courtroom began to buzz with notifications. Maria's story, detailing years of corruption and cover-ups, from low-ranking officers to high government officials, exploded on social media. The judge, sensing the commotion, ordered an emergency recess. In the courthouse corridors, politicians and officers ran frantically, trying to control the damage. Luke, observing the chaos around him, felt a mixture of fear and hope. He looked at Maria, who nodded discreetly, a silent gesture of solidarity. When the court resumed, the air was charged with expectation. The jury returned with a surprisingly swift verdict. "We find the defendant, Sergeant Robert Johnson, guilty on all charges," announced the jury spokesperson. A roar of approval echoed through the room, while Sergeant Johnson collapsed in his chair, defeated, but the victory in court was just the beginning. Outside, crowds were gathering, demanding a full investigation based on Maria's revelations. The city was on the brink of profound transformation. Luke, leaving the courthouse with his family, was greeted as a hero by the crowd. He looked at Maria, who was surrounded by reporters, and Captain Reynolds, who was intensely conversing on the phone. At that moment, Luke realized that his journey, like the fight for justice in Chicago, was far from over. This was just the beginning of a new era, an era of accountability and change. The question now was, how far would this wave of change go, and who else would be swept away by it? In the weeks that followed Sergeant Johnson's trial and the publication of Maria's explosive article, Chicago found itself in the midst of a tumultuous transformation. The repercussions were immediate and intense, extending far beyond the city limits. The President of the United States, pushed by public opinion and national and international media, announced the creation of an independent task force to investigate all cases of police abuse and corruption mentioned in Maria's report. "We cannot and will not tolerate the violation of our citizens' rights by those who are meant to protect them," he declared during a tense press conference. Meanwhile, Luke found himself unexpectedly in the spotlight. Invitations for interviews and TV shows arrived daily. Initially reluctant, he decided to use his new platform to advocate for real change. "I don't want another child to go through what I went through," he said, during an emotional interview that went viral on social media. Mrs. Williams, Luke's mother, became an active voice in the community, organizing support groups for families affected by police violence. "Our silence didn't protect us in the past," she declared at a community meeting. "It's time our voices are heard." Captain Reynolds, recognized for her integrity during the case, was appointed to lead the reform of the Chicago Police Department. Her first action was to implement a mandatory training program on human rights and racial relations for all officers. "We must change the culture from within," she affirmed. Maria, now a nationally renowned journalist, continued her investigation, uncovering more cases of corruption and abuse. Her tireless work began to reveal links between corrupt politicians and certain sectors of the police, leading to a series of high-profile arrests. However, not everything was victorious. Maria began to receive increasingly serious threats. One day, returning home, she found her door forced open and a sinister warning: "Stop now, or you'll be the next headline." Frightened but determined, Maria turned to Captain Reynolds. "I'm not going to stop," she said firmly, "but I need help to protect myself while I continue this work." Captain Reynolds, recognizing the importance of Maria's work, assigned a special team for her protection. "Your work is vital to our city. We won't let them silence you," Reynolds assured. Meanwhile, at Luke's school, Julie was leading a student movement to educate her classmates about civil rights and how to protect themselves from abuse of authority. "Knowledge is power," she told her peers. The more we know our rights, the harder it will be to violate them. The city of Chicago, once divided by fear and mistrust, was beginning to show signs of positive transformation. Communities that previously feared the police were now working in collaboration with reformed officers to create community policing programs. However, not everyone was happy with the changes. Conservative groups and sectors of the police resisting reform began to organize protests, claiming that the new measures were tying the hands of police officers and compromising public safety. One day, during a tense demonstration in front of City Hall, Luke surprised everyone by taking the stage. With maturity beyond his years, he addressed the divided crowd. I know what it's like to be afraid of the police, but I also know that not all police officers are bad. What we need is not more division, but understanding and real change. This isn't about revenge, it's about building a city where everyone can feel safe and respected. His words touched many hearts, including those of some police officers present. A veteran officer, visibly moved, approached Luke after the speech. You've made me see things in a new light, kid, he said, extending his hand. As Luke shook the officer's hand, a photographer captured the moment. The image would become a powerful symbol of hope and reconciliation. However, the struggle was far from over. While some celebrated progress, others plotted in the shadows to maintain the status quo. The question that arose was, how far would those who felt threatened by the changes go to protect their interests? 6 months had passed since Sergeant Johnson's trial, and Chicago was experiencing a period of tumultuous transformation. The reforms initiated by Captain Reynolds were beginning to bear fruit, but they also faced fierce resistance from conservative sectors of the police and politics. Luke, now 13 years old, had become an unwitting symbol of change. His photo shaking hands with the veteran police officer circulated on billboards across the city with the message, "Together for a fairer Chicago." However, celebrity came at a price. Luke struggled to reconcile his new public life with his desire for a normal adolescence. One morning, arriving at school, Luke found offensive graffiti directed at him on the walls. "Traitor, media puppet," the messages said. Shaken, he was consoled by Julie and other friends. "Don't let them intimidate you," Julie said, holding his hand. "What you're doing is too important." Meanwhile, Maria continued her investigation, now focusing on dismantling a corruption network that seemed to extend to the highest echelons of government. Her reports had already led to the resignation of 2 state senators and the arrest of several influential businessmen. One evening, while working late on her investigation, Maria received an anonymous call. "Tomorrow, 3 p.m. at the parking lot of Water Tower Place. I have information that will blow your case wide open. Come alone." Intrigued and cautious, Maria hesitated to go. Deciding the opportunity was too important to ignore, she informed only her editor-in-chief of the meeting as a precaution. The next day, Maria arrived at the meeting place. A middle-aged man, visibly nervous, approached. "My name is Richard. I worked as an accountant for some of the politicians you're investigating." Richard handed Maria a USB drive. "It's all here. Illegal transfers, bribes, money laundering. They'll kill me if they find out, but I can't live with this guilt anymore." They were unaware they were being watched. In a dark car parked nearby, men with grim expressions photographed the meeting. Meanwhile, Captain Reynolds was fighting her own battle. Her police reform was creating internal divisions. Officers resisting the changes were organizing a work-to-rule movement, drastically reducing police work in critical areas of the city. Reynolds was summoned to an emergency meeting with the mayor. "Captain, the situation is becoming untenable," said the mayor, visibly stressed. "Perhaps we should reconsider some of these reforms." Reynolds stood firm. "Mr. Mayor, backing down now would be betraying the trust that the people have placed in us. We must move forward." Leaving the meeting, Reynolds received an alarming message. There was a plan to sabotage the new community policing program, placing the blame on neighborhood residents. That evening, Luke was participating in an event in his community to promote dialogue between residents and the police. The atmosphere was tense but productive. Officers and citizens shared their views, seeking mutual understanding. Suddenly, screams erupted in the street. A group of hooded men appeared, firing into the air and causing panic. "This is what happens when you trust these thugs," one of the attackers shouted. In the ensuing chaos, Luke saw one of the attackers remove his hood for a moment. With shock, he recognized the face. It was a police officer he had seen at the station during his deposition months ago. As the community recovered from the attack, Maria was racing against time to verify the information provided by Richard. Each document she opened revealed a deeper level of corruption, involving personalities she never imagined would be implicated. With trembling hands, she began to write what would be the most explosive article of her career. "This is bigger than we thought," she muttered to herself, aware of the danger this revelation represented. The next morning, Chicago woke up to shocking headlines. Maria's article exposed a system of corruption that went from local police to the governor's office. At the same time, accounts of the attack in the community were circulating, with witnesses claiming to have recognized police officers among the attackers. The city was on the brink of explosion. Protests erupted in several neighborhoods, some demanding the resignation of the government, others defending the police. Luke, watching the news with his family, felt the weight of responsibility. "Mom," he said, turning to Mrs. Williams, "I think we need to do more. We can't let everything we've fought for be destroyed." Meanwhile, in a dark office in downtown Chicago, a group of powerful men met in emergency. "This ends now," one of them said, slamming his fist on the table. "Whatever it takes." The question hanging in the air was, how far would these men go to protect their interests? And how would Luke, Maria, and Captain Reynolds face this dangerous new phase of the fight for justice? Maria's revelations and the attack on the community had created a tipping point in Chicago. The city was boiling with protests, heated debates, and a general feeling that something big was about to happen. Luke, determined not to remain idle, decided to organize a peaceful march for justice and police reform. With the help of Julie and his classmates, they used social media to spread the message. "This isn't about us versus them," Luke explained in a video that went viral. "It's about building a city where everyone can feel safe and respected." Meanwhile, Maria was facing the consequences of her explosive report. She was receiving constant threats and was forced to move to a safe location. However, her determination did not waver. "If they're reacting like this," she told her editor-in-chief, "it means we've hit the mark." Captain Reynolds, for her part, was at the eye of the storm. Pressured by the government to roll back reforms and by citizens to intensify them, she found herself in an impossible position. At a tense press conference, she declared, "I will not give up on what is right. Change is difficult, but necessary." On the day of the march, organized by Luke, the tension in the city was palpable. Thousands of people gathered in downtown Chicago, carrying signs and chanting calls for justice. Luke, surrounded by his family and friends, led the crowd. Suddenly, a group of counter-protesters appeared, many of whom were off-duty police officers and their supporters. The situation threatened to turn violent when something unexpected happened. An officer on the front line, visibly moved, stepped forward and asked for silence. "I joined the police to protect and serve," he said, his voice trembling. "But over the years I've seen things that make me ashamed. Today, I'm here to say that we need this change as much as you do." His courageous gesture inspired other officers to speak out. One by one, they began to cross the line, joining the protesters in a moment of unity that no one could have foreseen. Observing from afar, Maria felt a glimmer of hope. She knew that this moment could be the catalyst for real change. However, not everyone was happy with this development. In a luxurious meeting room, the same powerful men who had sworn to end the reform movement were now in panic. "This is getting out of control," one of them said, watching the live coverage of the march. We need to act now, or we'll lose everything. They decided to play their last card, a fabricated dossier implicating Captain Reynolds in a corruption scheme. The plan was to leak this false information to the press, thus discrediting the leader of the reform movement. But they didn't count on Maria's insight. One of her sources within the government intercepted the plan and alerted her. She was now in a race against time to expose the plot before it could cause irreparable damage. As the march continued peacefully through the streets of Chicago, Luke was surprised by a familiar face in the crowd. It was Sergeant Johnson, recently released from prison. For a moment, the two stared at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then, to the surprise of all onlookers, Sergeant Johnson approached Luke. I'm sorry," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "What I did to you, there's no excuse. But seeing you here, fighting for change, it made me realize I need to change too." Luke, overcoming his initial fear, extended his hand. "Change begins with one step," he said, echoing the words he had heard so many times over the past months. As Luke and Sergeant Johnson shook hands, photographers captured the moment. The image would become a powerful symbol of reconciliation and hope. But the fight was far from over. Maria was rushing to publish her exposé on the plot. Captain Reynolds was preparing to face new accusations, and the powerful men behind the scenes were planning their next move. The question now was, would this moment of unity be strong enough to withstand the forces still fighting to maintain the status quo? And what would be the final price of change? Dawn broke over Chicago with an atmosphere charged with expectation. The images of the peaceful march, especially the iconic moment between Luke and Sergeant Johnson, had spread like wildfire across social media and newspapers. Maria, having worked through the night, was on the verge of publishing her latest and perhaps most dangerous report. She had managed not only to expose the plan to discredit Captain Reynolds, but also to trace a complex network of corruption reaching the highest echelons of state government. Heart-pounding, she sent the article for publication. "Let the truth prevail," she whispered to herself, knowing her life would never be the same after this moment. Minutes after publication, chaos ensued. Phones rang frantically in offices across the city. Panicked politicians summoned emergency advisors. Captain Reynolds, forewarned by Maria, prepared for a press conference that promised to shake the power structures in Chicago. Luke, at home with his family, watched the events unfold on television. His phone kept ringing, with journalists seeking comments on the new revelations and his encounter with Sergeant Johnson. "My son," said Mrs. Williams, placing her hand on Luke's shoulder, "you've triggered something bigger than all of us. I'm proud, but also worried." Luke nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. "I know, Mum, but we can't stop now." At the police station, a group of officers led by the one who had spoken out during the march was organizing an internal movement in support of the reforms. "It's time to clean our house," he declared to his colleagues. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, panic was turning into desperate action. The governor implicated in Maria's revelations was considering declaring a state of emergency under the pretext of maintaining public order. His closest advisors, however, were warning him about the possible consequences of such an action. In a distant neighborhood, Sergeant Johnson was fighting his own inner battle. His gesture at the march had turned him into a pariah among his former allies, but also into a symbol of hope for those who believed in the possibility of change. He decided to go further and offered to testify about the culture of corruption within the police. The city seemed to be on the brink of a peaceful revolution. Citizens from all social classes were taking to the streets, not to protest, but to celebrate and support the ongoing changes. Amid this turmoil, Julie had a brilliant idea. She proposed creating an app that would allow citizens to report and monitor interactions with the police in real time, promoting transparency and accountability. "Luke, this could be revolutionary," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. "We can use technology to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else again." The idea quickly gained traction. Volunteer programmers from across the city united to develop the app in record time. Captain Reynolds, seeing the potential of the initiative, decided to officially integrate it into the new community policing program. "This is proof that when we work together, police and citizens, we can create innovative solutions," she stated in an interview. But not everything was rosy. Maria, despite the success of her report, was facing severe retaliation. Her house was vandalized, and she received explicit threats against her life and those of her loved ones. Determined not to be intimidated, Maria made a surprise appearance at Captain Reynolds' press conference. "They've tried to silence us, but our voice is only growing stronger," she declared, her presence eliciting a wave of applause. The governor, seeing that the tide had definitively turned against him, announced his resignation in a televised speech, citing health reasons. The news was met with a mixture of celebration and caution, as many knew the fight was far from over. Luke, watching all of this unfold, felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. He knew he had helped initiate something important, but he also understood that the road ahead would be long and difficult. That evening, a candlelight vigil was organized in the square where it all began. Thousands gathered, including Luke, his family, Maria, Captain Reynolds, and even Sergeant Johnson. When Luke was invited to speak, he hesitated for a moment, then said in a firm voice, "What began as a moment of injustice has turned into a movement of hope. But our journey is just beginning. Real change requires each of us every day to choose to do what's right." As the crowd applauded, a question hung in the air. Would Chicago really succeed in maintaining this wave of change? Or would the forces of the status quo find a way to regain control? In the months that followed, Chicago experienced an unprecedented transformation. The app developed by Julie, now called Citizen Watchdog, became an instant success, ushering in a new era of transparency in police-citizen interactions. Captain Reynolds, now Chicago's police superintendent, implemented comprehensive reforms within the force. Training on human rights, de-escalation techniques, and racial sensitivity became mandatory. The new state government, elected on a platform of change, fully supported these initiatives. Luke, now 14, became a sought-after speaker at schools and community events. His story inspired both young and old to actively engage in building a more just society. Maria continued her investigative work, now with a dedicated team and enhanced security measures. Her reports helped dismantle deeply rooted corruption networks, leading to the arrest of several powerful politicians and businessmen. Sergeant Johnson, keeping his promise, testified in several trials, providing crucial information that helped clean up the police force. His act of redemption, though it didn't erase his past mistakes, paved the way for other repentant officers to come forward. However, not everything was rosy. Groups resisting the changes continued to operate in the shadows, seeking ways to undermine the progress made. Veiled threats and attempts at sabotage were constant, keeping everyone on alert. One day, Luke was invited to speak at an international conference on police reform. Nervous but determined, he took the stage in front of a global audience. "A year ago, I was just a boy who was afraid of the police," he began. "Today, I'm here to tell you that change is possible. It's not easy, it's not quick, but it's necessary and worth fighting for." As Luke spoke, cameras broadcast his image to millions of people around the world. His story and Chicago's transformation were inspiring similar movements in other cities and countries. In the audience, Maria smiled with pride. Beside her, Superintendent Reynolds nodded in approval. In the back rows, Sergeant Johnson watched silently, tears in his eyes. acknowledging the long journey they had all traveled. Concluding his speech, Luke looked directly at the camera. To each of you watching, remember, change begins with one step, one voice, one choice. Be that voice in your communities. The future we want is in our hands. As the audience rose for a standing ovation, Luke knew that while much had been accomplished, the journey was far from over. But now, for the first time, the future looked bright and full of possibilities. If you've watched this far, comment, "I watched until the end," and don't forget to click on the final screen video that will appear soon. Luke's story reminds us that real change begins with courageous individual actions. Each of us has the power to make a difference in our communities. Don't let this story be just entertainment. Think about how you can contribute to a more just and equal society. Share this video, discuss it with your friends and family, and most importantly, act in your own reality. Together, we can build a better world. Thank you for watching.